Our next speaker is Jared Ferguson. He's a Utah native and is a licensed clinical social worker. He completed his bachelor and master's degrees of social work from the University of Utah in 2007 and 2008. Along with his MSW, Jared completed an emphasis in substance abuse treatment. During his graduate education, Jared completed 2 internships at the Utah State Prison, which was an experience that forever changed his outlook on issues of justice and social equity. He has since focused on the areas of criminal justice, mental health, and evidence-based practices to address substance use disorders. When he's not working, you will likely find him pedaling around Salt Lake Valley with his friends and family while he thinks about helping things go right. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. It's good to be here today. Feel fortunate to have the choice slot of immediately after lunch. I will do my best to not put you to sleep. Thinking this morning about how I wanted to start off, and I guess I was talking to a coworker of mine at my day job, and came to the conclusion that this is going to be hard for me to get through because normally when I present on motivational interviewing, I present for about a 3-hour period. Today I'll be presenting for an hour, and I have a lot to say about the subject. So bear with me if I try to speed through some things. I do understand that I have an audience today that is relatively familiar with motivational interviewing and that many of you are required to take a yearly training. Am I correct in that? By show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the model, motivational interviewing? How many of you use it regularly, maybe weekly, or it's just part of your regular job description? Okay. And of those of you who use it, how many of you would say that you're highly comfortable with the modality? Okay, so I have a pretty good audience here of folks that I hope this will be some new material for, and for those of you who have some previous experience, I hope that this isn't too repetitive. So. Thank you again for the introduction. My name is Jared Ferguson, licensed clinical social worker here in the state of Utah. As you can see, my accolades, I guess. Currently work at First Step House, served there as the clinical director, position in which I've held for the last 5 years. I'm a Utah State designated examiner, so if you don't know what that means I could put you in the hospital for longer than 24 hours against your own will, so mind your manners, please. Father-ish. I joke about that because, like many dudes my age, I'm kind of a grown-up kid, and sometimes people can't tell who's who. And just sort of a general helping professional. So I get to speak at events like this a couple of times a year, and I like having these opportunities because it allows me to stay kind of current on some of the finer aspects of practice since I do a lot less direct service these days. But also I love teaching, talking in front of people, something that's never been hard for me, so excuse my zeal as we move through a presentation today. So motivational interviewing, basically we can think of this as a conversational style that helps people move towards change or accentuate changes that they've already made. We want to address unhealthy behaviors with the folks that we work with, and whether that be addiction or nicotine use, some sort of dietary-related condition, chronic disease. Motivational interviewing is a conversational style that can help move people through the difficulties of those conditions. Really, when you think about it, motivational interviewing has 2 main goals. The first goal is that we want to bring awareness to problems that a person may not know exists, or maybe in denial exists, and even potential problems that they know of, and increase motivation for behavioral change in those behaviors. And I guess maybe I should have underlined behavioral there because we change a lot of things up here before we change things here. And motivational interviewing is very helpful in that regard. So before we dig too far into the more finite points of MI, I would like to spend a couple of minutes talking briefly about kind of the broader aspects of change and some things that I've come to learn in my experience working with adult males 18 and older who have a substance use disorder and likely correlated mental health condition and, all sorts of other co-occurring things. We think about change, and we know that there are the stages. Everybody should be familiar with the trans-theoretical model of change. There's 6 main phases, some argument as to whether or not relapse is a part of that. But generally, we see that these stages are important because knowing where our clients are in relation to this spectrum helps us determine what motivational interviewing techniques we employ as we go about the helping relationship. And when talking about motivation, we ask ourselves, well, what creates it? What actually gets people to change? And if you're familiar at all with the creators of motivational interviewing, this name should stand out to you, Bill Miller. He says, you cannot create motivation where there is none. And the first time I read that, I thought, well, that sounds kind of terrible. Then I got thinking about it and wondered to myself, is anybody ever really, truly unmotivated? And I think the answer to that is no. A person may not be motivated to change the thing that we, as helping professionals, want them to change, but they may be motivated to do something else. And crafty helping professionals can start to weave those things together. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I think the answer to that question of are people ever truly unmotivated is no. And what are we to do? We are to practice brief intervention techniques like motivational interviewing. So speaking about motivation broadly, we can think of motivation as a cyclical process. And I tried really hard to draw a cyclical process in PowerPoint and came up short, so this is what you got. But the idea here is that motivation waxes and wanes, and over time it increases and then it decreases. And this waxing and waning can depend on a couple of different factors. In the substance use treatment world, we have these concepts of desperation versus willingness. And I think that in the medical world, this concept is equally true. Oftentimes, people change because they see something in their life that needs changing, and they have the level of insight that says, I probably should do something about this. Other times, though, people are unaware of that or maybe the scope of their problem, and they don't start doing anything about it until they have become desperate. So we talk about the gift of willingness or the gift of desperation. Which did you get? Because if you're unaware of your problem, then you might get the gift of desperation. And this awareness piece that I keep mentioning brings us to this other concept about the loci of control. Are we doing things, are we behaving, are we making changes because of things outside of ourselves? Or are we doing these behaviors, trying to make these changes because of things that are inside of ourselves? And these concepts are really important when we talk about change in the broader perspective. So with that in mind, it's important to know who and what we're dealing with when we enter into helping relationships and helping conversations. What kind of motivators are needed? Are we needing to motivate somebody through external means, or are we lucky enough to have somebody that is aware of their issue and is willing to do something about it but just needs a little bit of a push? Are there strengths that we can utilize to help this person further along in their process that may seem unrelated to the problem that they have? The strengths-based thinking is often lacking in a lot of helping settings. And we're trained as helping professionals often to find deficits and try to fix them. And that's what we fixate on. What is wrong? How do we fix it? Rather than also looking at what's going right and what's already working. In this broader context of helping people with motivation, we have to be able to identify barriers. And those barriers are our patients' barriers, our clients' barriers, and they are also your barriers. Because one of the reasons that people have have difficulty with motivational interviewing is because, well, we'll talk about this, but personal barriers that kind of prevent motivational interviewing from happening in the way that it potentially could happen. So, as we're talking about barriers, I want to kind of jump in real quick to The barriers that people often face, and when I say people, I'm talking about helping professionals and many clinicians that I supervise and help train. They say, well, I'm doing motivational interviewing and I'm not getting any effect. And the first thing that I come up to is this kind of question of whose agenda is being run here. And when I say that you, as in you all, are operating off of your agenda, that could be. It may be something that you personally want to see the patient do, see the client do. It could be the agenda of your company or organization. It could be the agenda of some outcome that you hope to see. But oftentimes, these are things that are extraneous to what the patient wants. So we're working an agenda, we're trying to push an agenda that is not the patient's. Additionally, I see people moving away from the basics of motivational interviewing. We're going to talk a little bit about this more in depth in a few minutes, but most of you, especially those of you who are required to go to yearly trainings, you know what there is to know about motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is not this like secret combination of tricks that you can do in a certain order, say it in a certain order, sprinkle some pixie dust, put a little holy water on somebody, and all of a sudden, pop, they change. It's not how it works. And people often forget that, and so they move away from the basic techniques that they learn in motivational interviewing towards these other things that they think are going to help, and it trips them up. So with that, talking about inconsistent application. If you think about a person who's coming into your office, let's say for smoking cessation, and the first time that you talk to them, you put a lot of pressure on them about quitting smoking. And then the next time they come in, you don't mention it at all. And the third time they come in, you don't mention it at all. But then your supervisor says, hey, have you had the conversation about smoking with your patient? And you don't. So the fourth time they come in, you all of a sudden want to talk about smoking again. What kind of a message does that send to the patient? It's a lot like parenting. If any of you are parents in the room, I'm sure many of you are, inconsistent application of parenting techniques can yield all sorts of interesting results in our children. They don't know which mom or dad they're going to get today, or whether mom came home in a bad mood or dad came home in a good mood. It's important to be consistent in these techniques as we continue to apply them. One of the barriers to motivational interviewing is conditioning, and this is your conditioning. Oftentimes when I'm reviewing a clinician's recording, or if I'm observing them in group, they come up against a topic or a statement that they're having trouble with, and they default back into this, well, how did that make you feel? What was that like for you? Kind of response. And what that does effectively is defuses the clinician's discomfort, but it also defuses any motivation that may have been built in the conversation up to that point. So it's important that we don't kind of recant or release that pressure, and we keep the person building towards this self-elicited motivational speech. And finally, I think this is finally, I'll mention the expert trap. And I might ruffle a few feathers here with what I'm about to say. And if I do, I apologize, but it's also kind of the point. You are not the expert. You might know a whole lot about smoking cessation. You might know a whole lot about chronic disease management, diabetes. You might know a whole lot about a whole lot of things. But that doesn't matter as much to the patient. The patient is the expert in the patient. And oftentimes, as highly trained, highly skilled helping professionals, we forget that. We think we know what's best. We're running that agenda, which sort of brings us full circle. And one final thing that I would mention here, so sorry, that wasn't final, is asking for commitment prematurely. As I mentioned earlier, motivational interviewing is sort of a process. There's timing involved. And if you ask a person for commitment too soon, you're likely going to trip things up. The first thing that they might ask is, geez, what's this person's agenda? And asking about commitment implies, readiness to change, which oftentimes people aren't quite there. They're not quite ready to do that yet. So making sure that we're timing this notion of commitment properly is really key, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. We can also talk about barriers in clients' lives. Don't want to spend too much time on this, but their conditioning is also a factor. People come from unhealthy environments and years, if not decades, of certain behaviors, and we should not be surprised that when things get tough, they go back to those behaviors. That hopefully is not new to anybody in the room. Our patients often have a lack of means or even a lack of faculty. They may not have the things that they need to get what they need done. In my world, this looks like a guy with 2, 3, or 5 kids from 1, 2, or 5 different women who has been court-ordered to treatment, who is also got a DCFS case open, who is being told by his DCFS caseworker that he has to work so he can get permanent housing for his kids, and he's coming to treatment 4 nights a week, and he's working 45 or 50 hours a week, and he's doing all this while he rides the bus. That's a serious lack of means, and that is not exclusive to the people that I work with in the public substance abuse treatment side of things. When we talk about lack of faculties, people are like computers. They can retain so much information. They can process information at different speeds. Sometimes as helping professionals, we want to line drive things right to them and expect they're going to get it and process it and have this moment where everything turns on and they say to themselves, oh, I got it. That's often not how things transpire in the change process. So we have to be aware of that limitation. And I think one of the most underrated things that we see as helping professionals is people who come from unsupportive recovery environments. If you've got a person with a chronic health condition like diabetes and you're trying to talk to them about limiting their sugar intake, and they go home to a home that is stockpiled with candy and other people who are eating this kind of stuff on the regular, how likely is it that we're going to see meaningful change anytime soon? We would say the same thing with people who suffer from substance use disorders. We pull them into treatment and we motivate them when we get them all ready to go, and they build a relapse prevention plan and they get 60 days clean, and they get out of residential treatment and maybe go to outpatient and move back home, and oh my gosh, mom's using meth. The recovery environment is a key aspect here that oftentimes gets overlooked in the process of motivational interviewing. Recently, doing some dietary research of my own, came across this quote, which I liked quite a bit because I think it's broadly applicable. Until something is, oh gosh, I wrote that wrong. I'm sorry. Until something is accessible, familiar, and enjoyable, you're out of luck. Accessible, familiar, and enjoyable, you're out of luck. And this, can take on different forms. If we're talking about, minor change, that's not that big of a deal. But how do you take a person who enjoys eating sugar, for instance, and get them to enjoy vegetables? That's a little bit more of a leap. So until something becomes accessible, familiar, and enjoyable, you're out of luck. So that's not this broad statement meant to demotivate you, but things that we have to keep in mind in terms of when we're having these helping conversations. Some quick myths about MI, as I mentioned earlier. There's no secret sauce here. And people need to be mindful of the fact that if you're receiving regular training in MI, you pretty much know what there is to know. There's not a way that you can say things in drastically different ways that are going to change your outcomes. Really what we're talking about is consistent application of the principles. People often believe that brief interventions are one-time events. They think that they're going to be able to walk into a helping setting and in 5 minutes or 10 minutes be able to say something the right way or say the right thing so that all of a sudden people have, again, that lights on moment where suddenly they want to do things differently. That's often not the case. People believe that change just happens when MI is done right in session or in clinic, and that's also simply not the case. Typically when we see change, it's the result of a lot of things that are beyond what we do. So let's talk about retooling some of these things that I mentioned earlier, just briefly. If one of the problems is that we're operating on our agenda or somebody else's agenda that's not the patient's agenda, then the simple answer to that is that we begin to investigate and learn about their agenda. And what is it that motivates them? What is it that they want to do? If they want to go into diabetic shock 3 times a year rather than 12, that's an agenda that we should support, right? Instead of, often we're like, oh, you can't go into diabetic shock at all. That's our goal, but that may not be realistic. So adopting their agenda. Again, as I've mentioned several times, sticking with the basics, working on your own conditioning and reconditioning those I would call them maladaptive treatment behaviors or those maladaptive conversational behaviors, so that when that moment comes up and you're not sure what to say, rather than going with the how did that make you feel comment, finding a way to continue on in mining for more motivational speech, for more change talk. And consistent application of MI principles here is also important. Again, if we're doing it 1 out of 4 times or 2 out of 4 times, that's simply not enough. We need to be doing it every time. And remembering here that you are not the expert. Remembering here that you might know a lot of things about a particular subject, but what we're talking about is helping a person who is an expert in themselves and who knows themselves be able to do something that they may not think that they're going to be able to do. Finally, we want to actively promote supportive recovery environments. If that person is not getting what they need from home, where can they get it? And sometimes we become brokers, in a sense, of this kind of information. And we'll talk a little bit about how to give this information in a way that is more likely to be received by the client or by the patient. Again, asking for commitment in an appropriate time rather than asking for commitment prematurely. Excuse me. So, with that in mind, we have to remember that when we're talking about behavior, there is a very, very basic equation that we can keep in mind in these moments when we get stuck. And this is not an MI thing. This is just sort of like the gospel according to Jared kind of thing. But need minus inhibition equals behavior. Need minus inhibition equals behavior. If a person's need to go home and enjoy that bag of Sour Patch Kids that they know that they have sitting on the counter is a 9, and the reasons to not do so are like a 4 or a 5 on the scale of 1 to 10, what is likely to happen? They're going to go home and they're going to eat those Sour Patch Kids. They might eat the whole bag, who knows? Keeping in mind also that need and inhibition are variables. And these are the variables that we can influence through techniques like motivational interviewing so that we can create a different balance in that equation. We can increase or decrease perceived needs, and we can help increase or decrease perceived inhibitions or perceived barriers. And as we alter those things, we can change outcomes. So this little formula has been very helpful for me over the years as I've gotten stuck on with different clients from different scenarios. And when I'm kind of not sure where to go, I'm thinking about need minus inhibition. What do I need to work on here? Do I need to work on the need? Do I need to work on the inhibition? Which do I need to increase? Which do I need to decrease? Keeping in mind with some of these basic concepts of change, that change does take time. Sometimes can take a long time. If you think about changes that you've made in your life, oftentimes they're not just things that you wake up to one day and do. Show you a little graph here. This is actually straight from the Motivational Interviewing book, which if you have not read, I'm going to make a plug for. I have a copy, and it's in my bag more often than not. And it's not because I'm talking about this stuff all the time. But so this graph here, what we're looking at is essentially an analysis of 61 motivational sessions. And each one of these decrements here represents 5 minutes within the session. And you'll see that as time elapses in the session, the instances of motivational, self-elicited motivational talk, change talk, increase. The first 20 to 25 minutes of the session are all sustained talk. It's a person talking themselves into a reason that they do not want to change. And it's not until that 20 to 25 minute mark that a person crosses that line and starts getting into change talk. So again, back to that misconception or that myth about MI, this isn't something that you're going to be able to just do in 5 minutes. And if all you've got in 5 minutes or is 5 minutes, it's going to take a lot of 5 minutes to get this job done. And that's where the consistency becomes super important. One more thing about change basics here, and I don't know, I got $1 for anybody who can tell me what this lyric is from, but it sticks out in my head when I talk about this topic every once in a while. Is there anyone who ever remembers changing their mind from the paint on a sign? Anybody? I know you're going to go duh when I say it. Yes? No? The song is Belief by John Mayer. It's a good one. Go look it up. But I think it's actually the first line in the song, and it kind of kills me because, yeah, I think about billboards that I see maybe on the way to work, and I'm like, wow, am I going to go like completely change this, this belief system that I have, or this behavior that I have based on something that I just read, some momentary instance? And the answer is probably not. I mean, maybe, but probably not. Change is nonlinear. Again, I tried to draw that graph earlier. Change is not this great, start from point A and go to point B process. It looks a lot like this. And change is also multifaceted, meaning that a person could be willing to make a behavioral change in one area of their life and be completely unwilling to look at something else. We see this a lot of times in substance use treatment. A person is surely willing to do something about their meth use because they're tired of going to jail. And they don't want to be a heroin addict anymore because they're tired of their friends dying, but they don't want to talk at all about their diabetes. And so keep in mind that when we're talking about change, we're not just talking about this broad concept of like a person is going to change. It's what are they going to change? And a person can be in any one of those 6 phases of change that we mentioned earlier, in any one of these various aspects of their life at any time. So we have to keep in mind that it's important to note with our clients, with our patients, where they are in these various spots. And again, look at what's going right and focus on some of those things. Change takes time, heat, and pressure. You can't create time most of the time for your clients, but you can create heat and pressure. That's part of your job as helping professionals. And does anybody know what the #1 correlated reason is to a person quitting smoking, to smoking cessation? What is the #1 variable in a person's successful quit attempt? Heart attacks, I heard. Say again? Costs.
How many times they've tried to quit?
How many times they've tried to quit? That's getting closer. The #1 variable is actually the number of times they've been asked. The number of times they've been asked. If you think about this, most people who smoke, or most people who have some sort of chronic health condition, we're not telling them anything they don't know. So it's not the number of times we tell them they need to quit. It's the number of times that they're asked if they will quit, which is an interesting little fact in my opinion. One more thing to keep in mind here about the basics of change is that the change that we do see in our patients is often the result of the work of others. Some of that's our work, but a lot of that is actually the work of others, especially the patient. We have X amount of time with them in any given week or in any given session, any given clinic hour or clinical moment. And there's a lot of things that happen outside of that time that we have together that also keep that person moving towards change. So back to some of the finer points of motivational interviewing. Before we jump into this real fast, any questions about anything that I've said so far? Anybody want to argue with me? I'd appreciate that. It's sometimes hard to be up here talking all by yourself, even though I do like it. Okay, so 4 main phases of MI. We're going to focus in on 2 of them today. We have engaging, focusing, evoking, and planning. Hopefully these are familiar phases to you. These kind of like the four main steps that we go through when helping a person in motivational interviewing. Engaging, is when we're doing a lot of listening. We are using our OARS skills. By show of hands, how many people know and use your OARS skills? If you don't know that, please write this down. Open-ended questions. How many of you ask open-ended questions rather than closed-ended questions? Affirming We are giving affirmation to our patient, giving affirmation to our client, perhaps about some effort that they've already made, perhaps about the difficulty of their situation or the reality of their situation. We want to reflect what the patient is saying back to us. We also want to summarize what the patient is saying to us. So these skills are super important. And values. This is part of the engaging phase of MI. We're going to talk a little bit more here about values because I do think it's one of the shortcomings of motivational interviewing. But in the book, they reference a values exercise that I think can be tremendously helpful. We're going to talk a little bit about values in another context as well. So real quick, MI and values work. The notion that this is an MI shortcoming is mine, so you can agree with me, you can disagree with me. I just find it difficult to grasp this idea that we have a conversation about values once and then we move on from it. I know that when I've made changes in my life, I come back to my own values constantly, even after I have successfully made a change and perhaps feel like going back. I'm having this conversation with myself about, is this in line with what I said I wanted? Is this living towards that value? And if the answer is no, then probably less likely to do the behavior. But MI sort of focuses on it in this engaging part, which is upfront part of therapy. And the truth of the matter is, values work needs to continue on throughout a therapeutic process. Whether you're talking about a medical issue, whether you're talking about substance use disorder, the reasons that people make change are often values driven. And so it needs to be a continued topic of discussion. Theoretically, like I said, this in MI is an initial focus. It's something that we get out of the way, kind of up front. What do you value? All right, we move on from that. And with that notion in mind that change is nonlinear, we have to keep coming back to this discussion of values because people lose sight of them. Okay, so the exercise that I said that the book mentioned is something called the personal values card sort. There's a link here, motivationalinterviewing.org/personal values card sort. You'll have access to this presentation, so you'll have this link, and I could actually even email the PDF of this for distribution as well. It's widely available, it's public domain, it's free to use. And it really can be used in two ways. It's kind of cool. You can take the cards and you can sort them with your client, with your patient. Again, I know this takes time, but it is worth it. Based on level of importance, very important to me to not important to me, 5 different levels, and they get to sort these things in the categories that are important to them. Or you can use it as like a top 10. They can sort through all of the different cards and figure out, well, these are the 10 most important things to me. And it's a super basic form. This is kind of a sample of it. You'll see again these categories: important to me, not important to me, very important to me. You put those 3 up top. And then acceptance, accuracy, achievement, adventure. Person starts ranking those things in order of that level of importance. And this generates a lot of fodder for conversation about behavioral change. Because oftentimes people are identifying values that are not only inconsistent with, but in contrast to their behaviors. People are often doing things that are like the polar opposite of what they say they want or what they say they value. And it's not until we point these things out that people start to become aware of that. If I value family and being around for my family, and yet I am engaging in behavior that is having a negative impact on my health and decreasing the likelihood of me being around for another 25 years, can I really say that I value my family and being there for them? That's a tough question for some people to answer. And many people that we work with have never thought this process through actively. So again, I think that's a super cool and easy to use exercise. You can print these cards, you can kind of have them at your disposal, especially when you're meeting somebody for the first time or early on in your helping relationship. Something to focus on, something to think about when we're talking about focusing is tackling one problem at a time. Many times the people who show up in our clinics, the people who show up in our healthcare settings or helping settings, they are coming into us with myriad issues. They have so many things going on, and we're trying to fix all of it at once. And like the old elephant analogy, if I've got the elephant in front of me, where do I start? One bite at a time. We have to start with just one thing at a time, one problem at a time. What do we do when goals differ? What do we do when our goal for the client differs from their goal for themselves? Whose agenda do we come back to, right? Are we going to push the issue about, this is the change that I want to see, or are we going to say, okay, let's let you try this and see what happens? So being able to sort through what to focus on based on the client's own agenda. Exchanging information. This is the time when people fall into the expert trap the easiest. And in motivational interviewing, in coding and listening to these sessions, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, we have this notion of giving information versus giving information with permission. And neither one of them in the context of motivational interviewing are actually great. It's not a really great motivationally interviewing consistent behavior. But of the two, giving information with permission is definitely preferred. May I share this with you? Is it okay if I show you a brief video about whatever, as opposed to, pulling your phone out and showing them the video without asking, as opposed to getting into the lecture about why they shouldn't do this? So how we exchange information, how we give information is really super important. All right, we'll talk a little bit about evoking here. Change talk versus sustained talk. I hope everybody's familiar with these two things. Change talk is self-elicited statements from the client that encourage them to move towards goal completion or towards change. Sustained talk that comes from the patient about the reasons that they want to stay the same. Obviously, within the context of motivational interviewing, our job is to focus on change talk. And how we respond to change talk is, I would say, 60% of the job. And that kind of goes back to that bad behavior conditioning thing that I mentioned earlier. Often something that's unmentioned in motivational interviewing is this concept of evoking hope. Many times when people are facing a life-altering circumstance, a chronic health condition, they have lost hope. They are in your office because they have lost hope. And so being able to help them see that there is life after whatever can be tremendously beneficial. Developing discrepancy is one of the key interventions in this evoking phase of motivational interviewing. Pointing out that discrepancy earlier about, hey, this behavior doesn't match up with your value. And if you're unfamiliar with how to do this, there are some really wonderful skills within the book that can walk you through that. And again, sort of outside of the scope of today's presentation, but please, if you're unfamiliar with this topic or this intervention within the intervention, learn it, practice it. It can be super, super helpful. So moving on, those of you of a certain age in the room may remember this film, Walt Disney film from a long time ago. I'm not talking about this darn cat. I'm actually talking about the motivational interviewing darn cat. And as most of these things go, we have little acronyms that help us remember concepts to identify where we are in the helping process. Anybody familiar with the darn cats aspect of motivational interviewing? Those of you who raised your hand saying that you're comfortable with the modality probably should know this. Is this new for most everybody else? Okay, good. So this is kind of the meat of what I really want to get into today. And the reason I want to spend a few minutes on this specifically is because this helps you tell where the client is along that continuum of the phases of change. The things that they are saying are clues to determine whether or not this person is pre-contemplative, whether they're contemplative, whether they're thinking about making a change, or whether they're sort of already on the road. So DARN is an acronym for desires, abilities, reasons, and needs. Desires, abilities, reasons, and needs. So if you're thinking about what this sounds like in the context of a helping conversation, a person could be saying, I really want to do X. Or, I know I can do X. That would be an ability statement. My family wants me to do X would be a reason statement. And I need to do X would be a need statement. Now, why is this important? The thing about darn speech is that it typically indicates a person who is in what we would call the preparatory change talk, or the preparatory phase of the change process. That is pre-contemplation, contemplation. That's where a person's at when they start to say these kinds of things. And if a person's in flat-out denial, then we know they're fully pre-contemplative, right? I don't have a drug problem, I got a judge problem. I don't have a diabetic problem, I got a wife problem, right? When a person's saying things like that, we know that they are firmly in pre-contemplation, okay? But when they start talking about these desires, abilities, reasons, and needs, we know that they're starting to move along that continuum into this maybe pre-contemplated or this contemplative state where they say, you know what, I might actually have a drug problem. I might actually have a diabetic problem and not a wife problem. And the reason that this is important is because, as I said earlier, 60% of the job is how we respond to change talk. So when a person makes a desire statement, we can ask this question of how would you like things to change? When a person makes an abilities kind of statement, we can say, what do you think you might be able to change? Again, ability. We're focusing on those particular aspects of the statement. Why would you want to get more exercise when a person starts talking about, my family wants me to exercise more? Why would you want to do that? Well, be around for my kids, keep my wife happy. I don't like the way that I look. I mean, and that conversation starts to roll. So how we ask the questions in response to these statements is really important. What needs to happen in order for you to make this change? So again, darn type speech tends to indicate that a person is in the preparatory phase of the change process. All right, so seriously, still, darn cats. Silly, you won't forget it. Cats, we're talking about a different set of, a different kind of change talk that indicates that a person is a little further along. Commitment talk. When a person's talking about, not just wanting to do something, but saying that they will do something. That's important. Activation talk. What are the things that they're going to do to start this process? Oftentimes, when a person thinks about, gosh, I need to change my eating habits, they're going to say, I'm going to go home this weekend and completely clear off all the crap from my shelves. That's where I'm going to start. It's activation talk. And taking steps. What kinds of things might they have already done? What kind of things have they already decided that they are going to do, like clearing all of the crap off of their shelves? So when you start to hear this kind of talk, it becomes really important to get greedy and to start asking for a lot more of it. When we hear this kind of change talk, we want to just get into it. And so how we respond is super important. This is the mobilization phase of change. This is the person getting ready to change. This is when we know all the work that we put in is starting to pay off because this person is ready to go out and start doing things. It's a really good indicator. What will you do this week? Again, I mentioned earlier that asking for commitment too soon can be problematic. And hopefully with this illustration, you can start to see why. What will you do this week? That is a commitment question. How can you ensure that you're going to take your medication? as in what might be the barriers that could come up that would prevent you doing that or from doing that, so let's talk about that. And when will you use those new running shoes that you just bought? So again, how we respond to these statements is really, really important. And if I could say that this is sort of like the work, the hard part of MI, thinking out loud, it's probably true. In that graph that I showed you earlier of those 61 sessions, the researcher who conducted that study was not familiar with the MI modality, and during his review made the comment to Bill Miller that the sessions sounded scripted. How many of you have heard a session, a motivational interviewing session, that sounds like that? It sounds scripted. It sounds like a person's thinking really hard about what they're going to say. This is why. One of the most important parts of this intervention is just thinking about how we're going to respond to what the client has offered us. And sometimes it sounds weird, it sounds awkward, it sounds clunky. But it is the process that moves people forward. So if your sessions sound a little bit weird when you start doing this, or you're in clinic and it sounds weird and people are like, why are you talking like that? That's probably a good thing. That's probably a good thing. Mentioned the darn cats on a hill, preparatory talk versus mobilization talk. This illustration is helpful for me in my head. Once we get to the mobilization talk, I know that I've kind of crossed the motivational hill, or the top of the hill, the summit, where I don't need to continue doing all this, intensive work to get these self-elicited statements from the client. This again is a graph right from the book. Lots of little jewels like this in there. As you can see at the bottom here, we indicate pre-contemplation versus preparation and action, kind of in this continuum. So the final phase of motivational interviewing is planning. Again, not going to spend loads of time here, but it is an important one nonetheless. Developing a plan with the client is important. Keep in mind we're developing a plan for one thing at a time, unless the client is thinking that they might be able to do or maybe do three things. But developing a plan and keeping it focused is certainly important. In this phase of motivational interviewing, we continue to elicit statements from the client to strengthen commitment. And that looks like, how am I going to know that you have completed this X, Y, or Z behavior next time I see you? Asking for a way that the client will be able to prove it, so we're going to reinforce that commitment that they've made. We want to support the change process that they are willing to make, maybe not necessarily the change process that we want them to make. Oftentimes, as I said earlier, people are willing to start with one thing but not address something else, and that's okay. We want to support what they are willing to do and not come down on them for what they're not willing to do. So let's talk real quick about tweaking some common things in motivational interviewing. I hope that most of you are familiar with the readiness ruler. How many of you have heard this? On a scale of 1 to 10, how ready are you? Okay, good. The readiness ruler is actually it's perpetuated in a lot of motivational interviewing trainings, but it's actually not the preferred method of going about this that Bill Miller and Stephen Rolnick originally envisioned. What they actually envisioned initially is the importance ruler. Because when we talk about how ready is a person, what are we assuming? Well, we're assuming that they are ready, which they may not be, right? And asking that question can create pressure, and it's a bit premature because, as I said, that person may not actually be ready to change. So rather than asking the question of, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how ready are you to quit drinking? On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it to you that you quit drinking? We can tweak that intervention a little bit for a much better outcome. And I like this idea, but if the space is yours, like, I have an office, it's not particularly large, but I have enough room to do this. I'll say on a scale of 1 to 10, and I'll invite the client to join me, and I'll say, this is 1, and over here is 10. How important is it to you that you make this change? And I find that anytime I can do things, and it means I look like a spaz sometimes in session because I'm all animated and I'm drawing and I'm doing all this stuff, but anytime that I can introduce some sort of experiential component to the motivational interviewing process, I increase the likelihood that I'm going to have success. So if you're confined to a small clinical space, this might be a little hard. Maybe step out in the hallway, make it weird, that's okay. But try to introduce some experiential components to your techniques. One of the things that people often do is they look forward in motivational interviewing. They look towards a time when things aren't happening anymore, when the condition has been addressed, and they forget to look backwards. And it's often not possible, not often, it's sometimes not possible to do this, but it is important to go back and ask that question of, what did things look like before everything got out of hand? What did it look like before you had your diagnosis or before you started to get ill? What did it look like before your addiction took hold? Tell me about a time that you felt things were going well. That kind of a question can elicit a lot of important talk, because what people have done in the past is often what they aspire to do in the future. And then conversely, thinking of different ways to ask these questions is kind of fun. So when we're thinking about a future-oriented question, rather than saying, what are things going to look like when you're well, mix it up a little bit and say, if you could take a week off from your condition, if you could take a week off from your symptoms, what's the first thing that you would do? If you weren't bedridden right now, what is the first thing that you would do? And if you think about that, maybe in relation to something that you are struggling with yourself, you can see how this starts to elicit some really positive change talk. People start talking about the things that they want to do, the things that they value. So if you could take a week off from your condition, or if you could alleviate your symptoms for a week, what's the first thing that you would do? So again, minor tweaks to some of these more well-known motivational interviewing interventions. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this kind of MI portion. I've got just a little bit more to go through, but I want to make a plug for this before we close out with the motivational interviewing part. If motivational interviewing is a regular part of your job, get supervision. Find somebody who knows it, who is willing to coach you, who is willing to listen to you. Maybe this is an already established person. Maybe this is someone new. Seek out supervision. It's very, very helpful. Within the context of supervision, there are a couple of instruments available that established motivational interviewing coaches and clinicians use to determine whether or not MI is happening in any given conversation. At First Step House, this is the one that we have recently employed. And this measure here, the MIGHTY, Motivational Interviewing Treatment Integrity tool, determines two things. Is the spirit of MI present in a conversation, and are the behaviors that are happening within the session consistent with motivational interviewing? As I mentioned earlier, this notion of giving information versus giving information with permission, that comes from here. That comes from the MIGHTY. There's also a tool out there called the MIA Step, and forgive me, I'm a little less familiar with this acronym. Motivational Interviewing Assessment Supervising Tool for Enhancing Proficiency. Weber Human Services uses this tool as part of their MI Fidelity program. And we opted to use the other tool for a number of our own reasons, but the MIA Step is no less effective a tool at helping determining whether or not motivational interviewing is happening in the session. And a good coach, a good supervisor is going to be familiar with one of these two things, and there are others, but they're going to be familiar with an instrument like this and can listen to your sessions and help you learn some of these things a little better. And finally, if you can't do that, listen to one another's sessions. The simple act of recording yourself, and some clients are amenable to this and some aren't, but the simple act of recording yourself and listening to it with a peer or a group of your peers is tremendously helpful. It's also tremendously embarrassing. So you're going to have to suck it up. But listen to each other. Sit in, and if you've got somebody in your office that you feel is particularly good at this, take notes from them. If you feel you're particularly good at this, share with people what you know. Most of what I know about good MI did not come from the various trainings that I've attended or even the book that I've read. Actually, the 2 books that I've read. Most of it came from listening to other people who are much better than I. So 2 resources, again, I mentioned the book, and then the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers, MINT. I think it's mint.org. I could be wrong. Might be motivationalinterviewing.org. It's where that PDF that I mentioned earlier came from, and it can be a tremendously helpful resource in finding coaching or supervision if that's something that you're looking for. All right, so real quick, shifting gears, I want to get away from MI as a modality here for a second and talk briefly about a completely different side of treatment, something called acceptance and commitment therapy. Has anybody heard of acceptance and commitment therapy? Sweet. This is sort of a new favorite of mine. Real quick, acceptance and commitment therapy is something that is being referred to as a third wave therapy, a third wave of cognitive behavioral therapy. That simply means that it includes cognitive behavioral therapy, a little bit of motivational work, some mindfulness, and work on self-identity and self-concept. And as I say those 4 things, any helping professional in the room would probably say, yeah, those are the things that we talk a whole lot about. And ACT the ACT framework helps people teach this in a completely different, nonlinear way that can be super effective. Within the ACT, we have this thing called the hexaflex. That's the name of this diagram. The guy that created it, Stephen C. Hayes, is sort of the father of ACT. You can see there's these 6 main components, and one side of this is kind of categorized as acceptance and mindfulness processes, and on the other side of this, we have commitment and behavior change processes, and specifically, we have the values component. The reason that I'm mentioning this comes back to the weakness that I pointed out earlier, or my perceived weakness in motivational interviewing, is that there's not enough continuous focus on values. If you look at this diagram, what you'll see is that everything relates to everything. And there's no actual starting point. Depending on your client's abilities, their ability to abstract, how clear of mind they are, you can start almost anywhere on this diagram, wherever they are, and teach them this modality. But the values portion is the portion that in the public mental health and public substance use service side we have found to be the most effective. So talk briefly about values work. Some sample exploratory questions. We use this one in MI. It's also used in ACT. What do you want your life to stand for? It sounds like a ridiculous question. But if a person really answers it honestly, it can, again, generate a lot of good fodder for treatment conversation. Do you feel that continuing on in X behavior is consistent with your value of whatever, or consistent with your values? That question is a really nice pinpoint way of getting a person to talk about this kind of stuff. Some other interventions in ACT that are a little bit more grimy, but like, how would you prefer others remember you in death? Not a conversation that we often have in treatment, or we're often afraid to mention it unless you're dealing, with people who have chronic or terminal end-of-life conditions. And this one is a particular favorite of mine, but if you were to write about these experiences in your diary, would you allow a loved one to read it? I think for many of us, the answer is no. How does that conversation start to elicit discussion about values? What are you writing about? What are the things that you don't want people to read? How is that inconsistent with what you would want them to read? Again, completely, different angle on the same concept of getting people to start talking about what is important to them. All right. Do we have any questions? Please, somebody ask a question. Just one. Don't make me pick you out, because I will. No? All right. Well, with that, I've come to the end of the presentation today. I hope that you've received something here, some tidbit, some nugget that is important for you, that is helpful to you. This is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out. You can contact me by email. That's my mobile number. You can text, call, whatever. Happy to send you whatever information I have about motivational interviewing. And this presentation, as well as the accompanying PDF with the values intervention that I mentioned earlier, will be available after this. So thank you very much.